They gave me 12 materials in 40 minutes and told me the passing threshold was 400 load units. I set 9 of them aside inside the first 3 minutes. The cadet to my left, tall, pale blue skin, secondary eyelid membrane that kept flickering in what I later learned was surprise, made a sound I couldn't translate. Something between a click and a held breath. Let me back up. My name is Mira Solis. I am 17 years old. I grew up in my grandmother's ceramics studio on Kepler 9F, and I have been putting my hands on clay and fired earth and structural composites since I was old enough to wedge a block without dropping it. When I was 12, I built a load-bearing arch out of slip-cast ceramics and unfired clay plugs that held 600 kilos before it settled. My grandmother photographed it before I knocked it down. She keeps the photograph on the wall above the wheel she taught me on. None of that is in any official record. None of it was supposed to matter. The clerical error that put me at the Vethron Institute of Applied Construction Sciences was small as errors go. A single transposed character in a routing code. I was supposed to be an exchange observation attendee at a xenobotanical survey station 2 systems over. Instead, I got a bunk assignment, a cadet number, and a schedule card that began, on day 3, with a block labeled Structural Integrity Module, Intake Assessment. I did not correct anyone. I want to be honest about that. I should have flagged the error at intake. I didn't, partly because the intake process moved faster than I could parse it, and partly because, I will admit this, the schedule card looked interesting. The Vethron Institute smelled like cut composite and industrial sealant. The floors were polished to a grade that registered load distribution when you walked on them. I know this because one of the cadets told me, on the walk from the dormitory block. His name translated roughly to something with 4 consonants in a row, and I called him Vel in my head, which he seemed to accept. He had a crystalline quality to his collar ridge that I later learned meant he was paying close attention. He told me the floors fed data to the assessment infrastructure constantly. Every gram, every transfer. The institute knew where your weight was at all times. I thought about my grandmother's studio, where the floor was bare fired clay, and every step left a mark if you'd been working wet. The Structural Integrity Module assessment room was a long rectangle with 12 workstations and a load testing rail running along the far wall. Lead assessor Druven Koss stood at the rail. He was 6-limbed and wide-shouldered, and his exoskeletal frame made a faint harmonic sound when he moved, a resonance in the crystalline plating that the cadets all seemed to track without looking at him directly, the way you track a sound you've learned to read. He had 4 tactile pads on his primary hands, wide and flattened, and I watched him press them briefly to the assessment rail's surface before he spoke. He told us the parameters, 12 materials, cataloged in the kit in front of each workstation. The published specification for load-bearing threshold, 400 units. The published passing grade, 380, 40 minutes on the timer. He said the last 3 cohorts had achieved passing results on an average of 36 minutes. He said the highest single result in 41 sessions of this module was 512 units. Then he activated the timer and walked the rail. I opened the kit. The 12 materials were 2 grades of composite slab, a bundle of tension filament in 3 diameters, 4 ceramic plugs of varying density, a structural bonding compound, and what the catalog listed as a load distribution mesh. I picked up each piece in turn. The composite slabs were dense and consistent, which meant reliable but not efficient. The tension filament was rated to spec. The ceramic plugs were the interesting part. They were listed identically in the catalog, but they weren't identical. 2 of them had a slightly different thermal signature, cooler to the touch, marginally denser. You couldn't see it, you could feel it. I set 9 materials to the right side of the workstation. The cadet to my left made his click breath sound. I kept the 2 dense plugs, 1 composite slab, the heavier grade, and the structural bonding compound, 7 components total. I set the load distribution mesh aside too, because mesh distributes load horizontally, and I wasn't planning to build horizontally. I had 36 minutes left. Here is what I know about load-bearing structures that no formula I have ever read has adequately captured. The joint is everything. You can have the best materials in the room and lose them all to a bad joint. My grandmother taught me this the first winter I worked with her. She made me break things. Good things I had built. things I was proud of. She made me press on them until they failed, and then she made me look at where they failed, which was always the joint. Always. After that, I stopped building joints the way the book said to, and started building them the way the break said to. I built the structure in 22 minutes. It was not large, it was not elegant. It used a double compression joint that I had developed by trial and error over 3 years of building things that were meant to hold weight, and it seated the 2 dense plugs at the load points where the composite slab would transfer the most force, and I bonded it with exactly as much compound as the joint needed and no more. Because excess compound in a compression joint adds surface area without adding strength, which is a trap the books describe as optimal and my grandmother described as a waste of good adhesive. I set it on the testing plate and stepped back. Druvenkos was at the other end of the rail. He had not been watching me. He had been watching the 12 other cadets work through their full material kits in methodical sequence, cross-referencing the load tables that were posted on a display panel beside each workstation. I had not used the load table. I had read the load table on the walk-in, realized it was built for horizontal distribution architecture, and moved on. The cadet to my left placed his structure on the testing plate at the 31-minute mark. The scale returned 408 units. His collar ridge brightened. I heard Druvenkos make a notation. My plate was next. The scale initialized. It read my structure's contact points, 4, which is the minimum stable geometry, and began applying load. 400, 450, 500. Druvenkos had walked the rail toward me. I knew this because I could hear the harmonic resonance of his exoskeletal frame getting closer. 550, 600, 650. The scale paused at 681 units, ran a secondary verification pass, and returned the same number. 681. The record for this module, across 41 sessions, was 512. I know what silence in a room feels like when it has weight to it. My grandmother's studio went quiet like that sometimes, when something came out of the kiln that nobody had expected. The kind of quiet that is actually people choosing not to speak because speaking would make the moment smaller. The assessment room was very quiet. Druvenkos pressed his tactile pads to the rail surface, held them there for a long moment. Then he lifted them and looked at my structure on the scale. My structure, which was using 7 of the 12 materials and leaving 9 in a neat stack to the right of the workstation, and the harmonic resonance of his exoskeletal frame ran to a frequency I had not heard before. Not the attention frequency. Something else, he said, in the translated register that the Institute's system rendered for non-Kelvarathi cadets. The result field for this assessment does not have a classification for this outcome. I said, "Is there a harder module?" He looked at me for a moment. His tactile pads pressed together at his primary hands, which I later learned was an involuntary Kelvarathi response to encountering a problem that required a new category. He said he would have to look into that. I said, "Can I keep the other 9 materials?" I gestured at the stack. I was going to use them for something. He asked what. I told him I wanted to put a small shelf in the corner of my quarters. The surface they'd given me to set things on was rated for 2 kilos, which was not going to be sufficient. Druvenkos was quiet for a time. Behind him, the timer hit 40 minutes and stopped. The other cadets had set down their tools. He said I could keep the materials. He said he would file the result as a notation pending category review. He said the next module began at 0800. I thanked him and picked up the 9 pieces and carried them back to the dormitory block. Vel fell into step beside me without saying anything. His collar ridge running the bright, steady color I had started to understand meant he was thinking hard about something and had decided not to rush whatever came out. The shelf I built that evening held 11 kilos before I stopped adding weight. I stopped because I ran out of things to put on it, not because the shelf did.